They didn't just tear her service dog's vest. They tore the only thing she had left of her mother, a purple heart earned in blood, stitched into fabric with trembling hands 3 months after the funeral. You know, I've been thinking about this story for weeks now, and I still get chills every time I remember how it all started. Sometimes the universe puts people in your path to teach you something profound about courage, about standing up when everything inside you wants to fall down. Autumn Reeves was one of those people. It was October 2024, and if you've ever driven through suburban Phoenix in the fall, you know that golden light that makes everything look like a movie set. Pine Ridge High School sat right in the heart of one of those communities where the houses are big, the lawns are perfect, and everyone's driving cars that cost more than most people make in a year. This wasn't just any high school. This was where Arizona's elite sent their kids, where a single semester costs more than a state college education. The campus looked like something out of a tech company brochure, all glass and steel, with a maker space that would make MIT jealous and a robotics lab equipped with 3D printers worth more than most people's houses. Everything was designed to perfection, including the student body, or at least, that's how they liked to think of themselves. See, Pine Ridge had this culture, this unspoken understanding that excellence wasn't just expected, it was mandatory. Kids here didn't just get into good colleges, they got into Harvard, Stanford, MIT. Their parents didn't just have jobs, they owned companies, held political office, shaped the economic landscape of Arizona. And the children, well, they were groomed from birth to continue that legacy, which made what happened to Autumn even more remarkable and more tragic. Autumn was 17, a senior with eyes that seemed older than her years, and a mind that could solve engineering problems most adults couldn't even understand. 2 years earlier, she'd been hiking with her mother in the Superstition Mountains when a rock slide changed everything. The accident left her paralyzed from the waist down. But that wasn't the worst part. Her mother, Sarah Reeves, a decorated Army nurse who'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan, had pushed Autumn out of the way and taken the full impact herself. Sarah lived just long enough to make sure her daughter was breathing. The months that followed were a blur of hospitals, physical therapy, and grief counseling that never quite seemed to work. Autumn's father, David, was a veteran himself, Special Forces turned contractor who'd met Sarah during a deployment in Kandahar. He'd been struggling with PTSD long before the accident, and losing his wife while watching his daughter fight for her independence nearly broke him completely. But here's something about military families that civilians don't always understand. They're built to endure. Sarah had spent those final weeks in the hospital not just fighting for her own life, but planning for Autumn's future. She'd researched adaptive technologies, connected with veteran support networks, and most importantly, she'd arranged for Atlas. Now, you might think a story like that would earn a kid some sympathy, maybe some understanding from her classmates. But here's what I learned about places like Pine Ridge when you're different, when you need accommodations, when you remind people that life can change in an instant. Well, that makes some folks real uncomfortable. The first day Autumn rolled through those pristine hallways with Atlas by her side. You could feel the atmosphere change. These kids had been raised to believe that success was a matter of merit, that hard work and talent were all that mattered. The idea that life could randomly destroy everything you'd worked for. That made them nervous. And when people get nervous around things they don't understand, they often get cruel. Atlas was Autumn's lifeline, this gorgeous German shepherd, trained not just as a service dog, but with techniques Sarah had learned working with military working dogs overseas. Before the accident, Sarah had been planning to start a nonprofit training service dogs for veterans with PTSD. Atlas was supposed to be her first graduate, a gift for her husband, David, who had been struggling since his own deployment ended. Instead, Atlas became Autumn's guardian angel on 4 legs. What made Atlas special wasn't just his training, though that was impressive enough. He could sense Autumn's panic attacks before she even realized they were starting, position himself to help her transfer from her wheelchair, and navigate crowds in a way that kept her safe without making her feel helpless. But the real magic was in their connection. Sarah had spent those final months in the hospital working with both of them, creating a bond that went deeper than simple service dog protocols. "He's not just your helper," Sarah had whispered during one of their last conversations. "He's your partner. Trust him, baby. He'll know what to do when you don't." The vest Atlas wore wasn't just any service dog vest. Sarah had sewn it herself during those long recovery days in the hospital, using fabric from her old Army ACUs, the digital camouflage pattern that every soldier knew by heart. But the real treasure was what she'd stitched onto the chest, her Purple Heart medal, earned when an IED took out her convoy in Kandahar. The medal itself told a story that most people at Pine Ridge could never understand. Sarah had been treating wounded soldiers in a field hospital when the attack came. She'd stayed behind to evacuate the last patient while the building collapsed around her, taking shrapnel in her back and shoulder that would cause her pain for the rest of her life. But she'd saved that soldier's life. And the Purple Heart was recognition not just of her wounds, but of her choice to put others before herself. "So you both remember," she'd whispered to Autumn, her voice already getting weak, "that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is help someone else stand up." The first few weeks back at school had been challenging but manageable. Teachers made accommodations. Most students were politely distant, and Autumn threw herself into her studies with the intensity that comes from having something to prove. She'd missed most of junior year, but her mom had homeschooled her through the basics, and her natural talent for mathematics and engineering had never dimmed. Then came robotics tryouts. Now here's where the story takes its first real turn. And this is something that still makes my blood boil when I think about it. Garrett Wolf was everything Pine Ridge High School valued: smart, athletic, connected, and ruthless in that particular way that comes from never being told no in your entire life. His father was deputy mayor of Phoenix. His mother sat on the school board, and Garrett himself had been the undisputed king of the robotics team since sophomore year. Stanford was practically guaranteed. His older brother had graduated valedictorian and gone on to medical school there. But the Wolf family carried secrets that nobody talked about. Garrett's older brother, Marcus, had killed himself 2 years into medical school. The pressure, the perfectionism, the impossible standards had finally crushed him. The family never spoke about it publicly, just said he'd died in an accident. But everyone knew, and everyone understood, that Garrett was now carrying the weight of 2 sons' worth of expectations. His parents had invested everything, financially, emotionally, socially, in the idea that their children would be exceptional. When Marcus died, all of that pressure shifted to Garrett. Stanford wasn't just a goal anymore. It was a memorial, a way to prove that the family's sacrifice hadn't been in vain. Garrett dealt with this pressure the way a lot of privileged kids do, with Adderall he bought from other students, with a sense of entitlement that bordered on sociopathy, and with the absolute conviction that he deserved success more than anyone else because he'd suffered more than anyone else. But then Autumn showed up. She'd missed most of junior year recovering, learning to navigate the world from a wheelchair, adjusting to life with Atlas. When she came back senior year, she was different, focused, determined. And when tryouts for the robotics team leadership came around, she didn't just participate, she dominated. I still remember hearing about that day from Ms. Chen, the robotics coach. The challenge was to design a motor control system for a robotic arm, something that required not just programming knowledge, but an intuitive understanding of physics, engineering, and problem-solving under pressure. Garrett approached it the way he approached everything, methodically, systematically, using techniques he'd learned from expensive tutors and summer camps. His solution was competent, thorough, exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd been groomed for success since birth. Autumn's approach was different. She looked at the problem not as an engineering challenge, but as an accessibility issue. How do you make a robotic arm that can adapt to different users, different needs, different limitations? Her solution wasn't just elegant, it was revolutionary. She'd essentially redesigned the entire concept to be more inclusive, more intuitive, more human. The vote wasn't even close. Autumn Reeves became team captain, and Garrett Wolf became the kind of angry that festers. But here's what made it worse. Autumn didn't gloat. She didn't celebrate her victory or make Garrett feel small. She just quietly accepted the position and started working to make the team better. That grace, that maturity, somehow made Garrett's resentment burn even hotter. It started small, the way these things always do. Garrett would accidentally block the accessible entrances with his friends. He'd schedule team meetings in rooms that weren't wheelchair accessible, then act surprised when Autumn couldn't attend. He'd make jokes about special treatment and participation trophies, just loud enough for everyone to hear, but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability. The worst part was how calculated it all was. Garrett was smart enough to know exactly where the line was, how far he could push without facing real consequences. And he had allies, kids who resented Autumn's success, teachers who were uncomfortable with accommodations, parents who whispered about lowered standards. But Autumn, she took it all with a grace that honestly amazed me. She'd find another route, arrange for room changes, and work twice as hard to prove herself. Atlas stayed by her side through all of it. Those intelligent brown eyes watching everything, protecting his girl the way his training and his own big heart told him to. There were nights when Autumn would come home exhausted, not from the physical challenges of navigating school in a wheelchair, but from the emotional toll of constantly having to prove she belonged. Her father, David, could see it wearing on her. He'd find her in the garage sometimes, working on personal projects until 2 in the morning, pushing herself to be perfect because perfect was the only thing that seemed to earn respect. "Your mom used to do that," he told her one night, watching her calibrate a sensor array she'd built from scratch. Work herself to the bone trying to prove she was tough enough for the army, smart enough for nursing school, strong enough to save everyone. "Did it work?" Autumn asked, not looking up from her work. David was quiet for a long moment. "It worked until it didn't. The thing is, sweetheart, you shouldn't have to be twice as good to get half the recognition. But sometimes that's the world we live in." And that conversation stayed with Autumn, and it probably saved her life later. Because what her father was really teaching her was resilience, not the kind that makes you weak by constantly bending, but the kind that makes you strong enough to fight back when the time comes. The real explosion came on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. The robotics team was preparing for the state championship. This massive competition that would determine who went to nationals. For kids at Pine Ridge, nationals wasn't just an achievement, it was an expectation. The school had won 3 years running, and failure wasn't an option. Autumn had been staying late in the workshop, fine-tuning their robot's programming while Atlas dozed nearby in his carefully stitched vest. The work was intricate, requiring the kind of focus that made hours feel like minutes. She was optimizing the robot's path-finding algorithm, trying to shave milliseconds off its response time, the difference between first place and second place at nationals. She'd made a breakthrough that day, solved a problem that had been stumping the whole team for weeks. The robot's arm movement was finally smooth, precise, perfect. She was just saving her work, feeling that rare satisfaction of a problem solved elegantly, when she heard footsteps in the hallway. But these weren't the careful footsteps of a teacher doing evening rounds, or the hurried pace of a student who'd forgotten something. These were the deliberate, swaggering steps of people who knew they owned the space they were walking through. Now, here's something you need to understand about Garrett. He wasn't just smart, he was calculating. He knew exactly how to hurt people where it would devastate them most. And he'd been watching Autumn long enough to know that her connection to Atlas, to that vest, to the memory of her mother, that was her vulnerable spot. He'd been building up to this moment for weeks, maybe months. Every small humiliation, every accidental obstacle, every whispered comment had been preparation for something bigger. And tonight, with the workshop empty and no witnesses around, he was ready to escalate. 5 of them walked into that workshop: Garrett and 4 of his closest friends. Kids whose parents owned half of Phoenix's tech companies. They'd been drinking, not much, just enough to feel invincible, just enough to do something they might not have done sober. The smell of beer clung to them like expensive cologne, and their laughter had that ugly edge that comes when privileged kids think they're untouchable. "Well, well," Garrett said, his voice carrying that particular tone bullies use when they think they're being clever. "Look what we have here. The charity case working late again." Autumn looked up from her computer, and I can only imagine what was going through her mind. The workshop was empty except for her and Atlas. No teachers, no witnesses, no help coming. The nearest occupied building was the main school, a 5-minute walk across campus, and it was past 7 p.m. on a Tuesday. Even the custodial staff had gone home. "Garrett," she said quietly, her voice steady despite what must have been a racing heart. "I'm just finishing up. You can have the room in 10 minutes. But Garrett wasn't there for the room. He was there because his pride was wounded, because his guaranteed spot at Stanford felt threatened, because everything he'd been promised his whole life was slipping away to a girl who was supposed to be beneath him. And more than that, he was there because he could be. Because in that empty workshop, there were no rules, no consequences, no adults to tell him no. "You know what really pisses me off," he continued, stepping closer while his friends spread out behind him like a pack. "People like you, playing the victim card to get ahead. Poor little disabled girl. Gets to be captain because everyone feels sorry for her." The words hit Autumn like physical blows, but she'd heard variations of them before. What was different now was the setting, the isolation, the way Garrett's friends were positioning themselves between her and the door. Atlas stood up then, moving between Garrett and Autumn the way he'd been trained. The dog didn't growl, didn't bare his teeth. He just stood there, alert and ready. Professional. "Even got yourself a prop." one of Garrett's friends laughed. A kid named Kyle, whose father owned a chain of tech startups. "What's next? Gonna tell us he's a war hero too." And that's when Garrett noticed the vest. Really noticed it. The purple heart catching the fluorescent light. The careful stitching. The way Autumn's hand instinctively moved to touch it whenever she was nervous. His eyes lit up with the kind of malicious joy that comes when a bully realizes they've found the perfect pressure point. "Is that supposed to be real?" Garrett asked. And something in his voice had changed. Something darker, more focused. He'd found his target. "It belonged to my mother," Autumn said, and for the first time since they'd entered the room, her voice shook just a little. Not with fear, but with something deeper, the kind of emotion that comes from touching a wound that never quite heals. "Your mother," Garrett repeated, and he was smiling now in a way that made my skin crawl when I heard about it later. "Your mother who died in a hiking accident. Real heroic." The room went dead quiet, except for the hum of the 3D printers and the distant sound of traffic outside. Autumn's friends later said they'd never seen her look like that before. Not angry. Exactly. But like something was crystallizing inside her, hardening into a resolve that hadn't been there moments before. "She earned that medal saving lives in Afghanistan," Autumn said, her voice stronger now, "while people were shooting at her." "Oh, spare me the sob story," Garrett laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "You think wearing Mommy's costume makes you special, makes you untouchable?" What happened next still makes me sick to think about. Because it wasn't just violence, it was calculated cruelty designed to destroy something irreplaceable. Garrett reached down and grabbed the edge of Atlas's vest, not the dog, mind you, but the fabric. The fabric that Sarah Reeves had sewn with her own hands during the last months of her life. While fighting through pain and medication, and the knowledge that she was running out of time, Atlas remained perfectly still, trained not to react to touching unless it was a direct threat to Autumn. But when Garrett yanked hard enough to tear the stitching, when that purple heart went flying across the concrete floor with a sound like a broken promise, something in Autumn's face just broke. The metal hit the floor and skittered under a workbench, the ribbon tearing as it caught on a metal leg. The vest hung in tatters from Atlas's shoulders. The careful stitching that had taken Sarah weeks to complete, destroyed in seconds. But worse than the physical destruction was what it represented. The casual disregard for sacrifice, for memory, for the kind of pain that changes people forever. "You have no idea what you just did," Autumn whispered, and her voice carried something that made even Garrett's friends take a step back. But here's the thing about bullies like Garrett. They don't stop when they draw blood. They double down. The fear in his friends' faces, the shock in Autumn's expression, the destruction he'd just caused. It all fed something dark inside him, something that had been growing since his brother's death. "Oops," he said, not sounding sorry at all. "Guess your mom's fake medal isn't as tough as you thought." Kyle laughed nervously, but the other friends had gone quiet. Even through their beer-clouded judgment, they could sense that something had shifted, that this had crossed a line they weren't sure they wanted to cross. "Dude," one of them said quietly, maybe we should—" "Maybe we should what?" Garrett snapped, whirling on his friend. "Feel sorry for the girl who's been stealing opportunities from people who actually deserve them. Feel bad for someone who uses her dead mommy's military service to guilt people into giving her what she wants. Have you ever seen someone's world collapse in real time? Because that's what I imagine it looked like in that moment. Autumn staring at her mother's purple heart scattered on the floor. The vest her mother had sewn hanging in tatters, while 5 privileged kids stood over the destruction of the most precious thing she had left. But here's what Garrett and his friends didn't know. What none of them could have possibly understood. They'd just declared war on the wrong girl. And Atlas. Atlas remembered every single one of their faces, their voices, their scents. Military working dogs are trained for a lot of things. But one lesson is drilled deeper than all the others. Protect your soldier, no matter what. The workshop went dead silent, except for the sound of Autumn crying. Not loud, not dramatic. Just these quiet tears that somehow felt more devastating than screaming would have been. She rolled her wheelchair forward, slowly, carefully picked up the pieces of her mother's medal, the torn fabric that had been stitched with so much love. Atlas moved with her, pressing his warm body against her legs. But his eyes never left Garrett's face. Something in the dog's expression had changed too. A kind of alertness that went beyond normal service dog training. He was memorizing, cataloging, preparing. "We're done here," Garrett announced, like he was dismissing employees. "Come on, guys, let's leave the charity case to clean up her mess." As they walked away, laughing about something on someone's phone, Autumn sat in that empty workshop holding the destroyed remnants of her mother's gift. And for the first time since the accident, she felt completely, utterly alone. But then Atlas did something he'd never done before. He gently took the torn fabric from her hands, set it carefully on her lap, and placed his paw on her arm. Not for balance, not for comfort, but for something else entirely. When Autumn looked into his eyes, she saw something that chilled her and thrilled her at the same time. Atlas wasn't just her service dog anymore. He was her partner. And partners don't let attacks go unanswered. "They think they know us," she whispered to him, her voice steadying as she spoke. "They think they know what we're capable of." Atlas tilted his head, those intelligent brown eyes locked on hers, and for a moment it was like looking at her mother again. That same quiet determination, that same willingness to fight for what was right. But they're about to find out they were wrong. Because here's what was about to happen next. And this is where our story really begins to get interesting. Garrett Wolf thought he'd just put Autumn Reeves in her place. What he actually did was wake up something in her that had been sleeping since the day she lost her mother. Something that remembered every lesson Sarah had taught her about standing up for what's right, about protecting the people who can't protect themselves. And Atlas. Well, Atlas was about to remind everyone at Pine Ridge High School that service dogs aren't just trained to help their handlers navigate the world. Sometimes, they're trained to fight back. The next morning, Autumn wheeled into school with Atlas by her side, and everyone who saw them noticed something different. The dog's military bearing was more pronounced, his attention more focused. But it was Autumn who really drew stares, not because she looked broken or defeated, but because she looked dangerous. She'd spent the night researching, planning, remembering everything her mother had taught her about strategic thinking. Sarah hadn't just been a nurse, she'd been a combat medic who'd learned to think 3 moves ahead, to anticipate threats, to protect her people no matter what the cost. And now it was time for Autumn to put those lessons to use. If this story is hitting close to home for you, if you've ever felt that kind of powerless rage when someone destroyed something precious to you, well, stick around, because Autumn's story is just getting started. And what happens next is going to surprise everyone, including Garrett Wolf. Have you ever had someone cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed? Let me know in the comments, because what Autumn did next, well, it's going to make you think about justice in a whole new way. The next 3 weeks were when Garrett Wolf showed everyone just how dangerous a smart bully with unlimited resources could be. You see, destroying Autumn's vest wasn't enough for him. That had been personal, visceral, the kind of cruelty that comes from rage. But what followed was something much more calculated, much more systematic. Garrett had decided that if he couldn't beat Autumn with talent, he'd destroy her with technology. It started with social media. Within 48 hours of the workshop incident, a video appeared on TikTok that made my blood run cold when I first saw it. Someone had used deepfake technology, sophisticated AI that could manipulate video footage, to create what looked like security camera footage of Autumn standing up from her wheelchair, walking around, then sitting back down when she thought no one was looking. Within 6 hours, it had 500,000 views. By the end of the week, it was approaching 2 million, with thousands of comments calling Autumn everything from a fraud to a criminal. The hashtag #FakeDisabled started trending, and suddenly Autumn found herself the center of a nationwide controversy about disability fraud. What made it worse was how believable it seemed to people who wanted to believe it. In a world where everyone was suspicious of everyone else, where social media had taught us to question everything, the idea that someone might fake a disability for advantage felt entirely plausible to a certain kind of person. Autumn tried to fight back, tried to explain that the video was fake, but the internet had already made up its mind. Her Instagram comments became a cesspool of hatred and accusations. Random strangers would stop her on the street to call her a liar. Someone even called Child Protective Services with a tip that she was defrauding the state by using disability accommodations she didn't need. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because Autumn wasn't fighting this battle alone. Luna Vasquez was 17 years old, lived in Tucson, and had never met Autumn in person. But she'd been following the story online, and something about it didn't sit right with her. Luna was what people in the tech world call a white hat hacker, someone who used their computer skills to expose fraud and protect people. And the more she looked at that viral video, the more convinced she became that it was fake. Luna spent 3 sleepless nights analyzing the footage frame by frame, and what she found made her furious. The deepfake was good, but it wasn't perfect. There were tiny inconsistencies in the lighting, subtle glitches in the facial mapping, metadata that didn't match the supposed timestamp. She had proof that the video was fabricated, but she needed more than that. She needed to know who made it. That's when Luna did something that probably saved Autumn's life. She hacked Garrett's phone. I'm not going to give you the technical details of how she did it, partly because I don't understand them myself, and partly because some knowledge is too dangerous to share. But what Luna found on Garrett's device was like looking into the mind of someone who'd completely lost touch with reality. There were dozens of research files about deepfake software, tutorials he'd downloaded, practice videos he'd made. But worse than that were the text messages, conversations with drug dealers about buying Adderall, discussions with his friends about taking down the charity case, and most disturbing of all, messages with his father about maintaining the family's reputation no matter what it takes. Luna also found something else, evidence that Garrett had been buying illegal stimulants for months, probably to help him keep up with the academic pressure. And more than that, she found messages that suggested he was planning something bigger than just social media harassment. Phase 2, one of his notes read, is the pep rally. Maximum audience, maximum humiliation. End this once and for all. Luna immediately reached out to Autumn through an encrypted messaging app, sharing everything she'd found. But when Autumn tried to take this evidence to Dr. Hartley, the school psychologist, something strange happened. Dr. Hartley barely looked at the files. "These could be fabricated," she said dismissively. "And even if they're real, hacking someone's phone is illegal. I can't act on illegally obtained information." What Autumn didn't know, what none of us knew at the time, was that Dr. Hartley was already compromised. Garrett's father, the deputy mayor, had been making generous donations to the school's mental health program. Not bribes, exactly, but the kind of financial support that makes people very reluctant to bite the hand that feeds them. So when the morning of the homecoming pep rally arrived, Autumn felt more alone than ever. Luna's evidence had been dismissed. The cyberbullying was reaching fever pitch. And Garrett was walking around school like he'd already won. But Atlas seemed different that morning, more alert, more focused, like a soldier preparing for battle. The pep rally was held in Pine Ridge's massive gymnasium, with over 1,000 students, parents, and faculty packed into the bleachers. It was supposed to be a celebration of school spirit, a chance to highlight the achievements of various teams and clubs. The robotics team was scheduled to give a presentation about their upcoming state championship. Autumn wheeled onto the gym floor with Atlas beside her, and immediately felt the weight of hundreds of stares. Some were curious, some were hostile, but all of them carried the question that had been following her for weeks: was she really disabled? Or was this all an elaborate lie? Garrett took the microphone first, smooth and confident as always. He talked about innovation, about merit, about the importance of fair competition. But there was something in his voice, something that made Atlas's ears prick up with attention. "Before we celebrate our team's achievements," Garrett said, his voice carrying clearly through the gym's sound system, "I think it's important that we address the elephant in the room. There have been some serious questions raised about the integrity of our selection process, about whether certain individuals have been honest about their circumstances." And that's when he did it, with the entire school watching, with parents and teachers and administrators all present. Garrett pulled out his phone and projected that deepfake video onto the gymnasium's massive screen. The room erupted in gasps, murmurs, and scattered applause. On the giant screen, Autumn appeared to stand up from her wheelchair, walk several steps, then sit back down when she thought no one was looking. To most of the audience, it looked like definitive proof that everything they'd been whispering was true. "I think," Garrett said, his voice dripping with false concern, "that we need to have an honest conversation about stolen valor, about people who appropriate the struggles of truly disabled individuals for their own gain." He gestured toward Atlas, toward the carefully repaired vest that Autumn had sewn back together with trembling hands. "That dog is wearing military insignia that belongs to someone who earned it in combat, someone who actually served their country, not someone who's playing dress-up for sympathy points." The crowd was getting uglier by the second. Someone shouted, "Fraud!" from the bleachers. Others were taking pictures, recording videos, feeding the online mob that was already gathering. But here's what Garrett didn't know. What his arrogance had blinded him to Atlas wasn't just any service dog. He'd been trained by a woman who understood military protocol, who knew that some things are sacred, who'd drilled into him one lesson above all others: protect your soldier from anyone who tries to hurt them. And when Garrett stepped off the makeshift stage, when he walked directly toward Autumn with that crowd behind him, when he reached down to grab Atlas's vest like he had that night in the workshop, the dog remembered every moment of his training. What happened next lasted maybe 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds changed everything. Atlas moved with the precision of a military working dog, targeting the one spot that would neutralize a threat without causing permanent damage. Garrett hit the gymnasium floor screaming, clutching his groin, his face going white with shock and pain. The crowd went silent except for Garrett's agonized cries. And in that silence, something beautiful happened. Deputy Martinez, a man I hadn't mentioned before because nobody knew he was there, stood up in the bleachers and began walking toward the gymnasium floor. Deputy Martinez had served with Sarah Reeves in Afghanistan. He'd been the one who held her hand while she died, who promised her that he'd watch over Autumn if anything ever happened. And for 2 years, he'd been quietly investigating Garrett Wolf, building a case, waiting for the right moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice boomed across the silent gymnasium as he pulled out his badge. "I'm Deputy Martinez with the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office, and I have a warrant for the arrest of Garrett Wolf." It turned out that Sarah Reeves had been more strategic than anyone realized. Before she died, she'd reached out to her old military contacts, explained the situation with Autumn's disability, and asked them to keep an eye on her daughter. She'd predicted that someone would eventually try to exploit Autumn's vulnerability, and she'd put protections in place. Luna's hacking had provided the evidence, but Deputy Martinez had been gathering his own intelligence for months, not just about the cyberbullying and the deepfake video, but about Garrett's drug dealing, his father's attempts to influence school officials, the entire network of privilege and corruption that had enabled the harassment. As Garrett was being read his rights, still doubled over in pain, Deputy Martinez looked at Autumn and said something that made her cry for the first time since that night in the workshop. "Your mother sent me, soldier. She wanted you to know that you're never fighting alone." The aftermath was swift and decisive. Garrett was expelled, charged with criminal harassment, distribution of controlled substances, and creation of fraudulent digital media. His father resigned from the deputy mayor position when the corruption investigation began. Dr. Hartley was fired when her financial relationship with the Wolf family came to light. But the most important thing that happened was what Autumn did with her pain, her anger, and her brilliant mind. Using the prize money from winning the state robotics championship, which her team did decisively, Autumn developed something called the Atlas Protocol. It was an AI system that could detect deepfake videos in real time, identify cyberbullying patterns before they went viral, and protect vulnerable individuals from digital harassment. The truth is, there are Garretts and Autumns in every school, every workplace, every community in America. The difference isn't in their circumstances, it's in how they choose to respond to those circumstances. And Atlas? Well, Atlas chose to do what the best of us do when someone we love is threatened. He stood up, he acted, and he reminded everyone watching that, sometimes, justice has teeth. That's the end of Autumn's story. But maybe it's the beginning of yours, because in a world full of Garretts, we could all stand to be a little more like Autumn, a little braver, a little kinder, and a lot more willing to bite back when it matters most. 6 months later, I visited Pine Ridge High School to see how things had changed. What I found there still gives me hope for humanity. The robotics lab had been renamed the Sarah Reeves Innovation Center, not by the administration, but by the students themselves, who'd raised money through bake sales and car washes to install a plaque with her Purple Heart story engraved on it. Every kid who enters that lab now knows they're walking on sacred ground. Luna Vasquez transferred to Pine Ridge for her senior year. She and Autumn became inseparable, building not just technology, but a movement. Their Atlas protocol is now used in 17 states, protecting over 50,000 students from digital harassment. Microsoft offered to buy it for $10 million. They turned it down. Money isn't the goal, Autumn told me during our interview. Change is. Deputy Martinez still visits the school every month, not as law enforcement, but as a mentor. He started a program teaching students about digital citizenship and standing up for each other. He carries a photo of Sarah Reeves in his wallet, right next to pictures of his own kids. And Atlas, that beautiful, brave dog, is still by Autumn's side, still wearing his carefully repaired vest. But now he has company. The school started a service dog training program, partnering with local veterans to train dogs for students with disabilities. They call it the Atlas Initiative. My mom always said that pain becomes power when you use it to protect others, Autumn told me. Garrett tried to break us. Instead, he helped us build an army. Sometimes the greatest victories come from the worst defeats. Sometimes the strongest warriors are the ones who've been broken and chose to rebuild. And sometimes, just sometimes, one girl and her dog can change the world. Remember that. When life knocks you down, remember Autumn, remember Atlas, and remember that you're never as alone as you think you are. The rifle trembled in her calloused hands as Madison Clark stood at the entrance of Blackstone Elite Shooting Club. Behind her, a rusted 1994 Ford pickup truck, the same one her dead husband left her along with $73,000 in medical debt, leaked oil onto the pristine asphalt. The valet's expression said, "Everything trailer trash doesn't belong here." "Ma'am, I think you're confused." The young man in the crisp uniform barely concealed his smirk. "This is a private facility. The Walmart sporting goods section is about 20 miles that way." Madison's weathered face, marked by sun damage from years of working double shifts at the truck stop diner, remained impassive. At 43, she looked 55. Single motherhood, food stamps, and choosing between electricity and her daughter's asthma medication had a way of aging a woman. Her faded Carhartt jacket, bought at Goodwill for $4, hung loose on her thin frame. "I have an appointment," she said quietly, her Kentucky accent thick as molasses. "The $100,000 championship tryouts." The laughter that erupted from the group of society women exiting their Mercedes SUVs was sharp enough to cut glass. Madison recognized the type immediately. Botoxed faces that never moved quite right. Designer handbags worth more than her trailer. And that particular brand of cruelty that came from never knowing real struggle. Did she just say championship Brittany Ashford Fitzgerald, pharmaceutical heiress and 3-time club champion? Didn't bother lowering her voice. Someone should tell her this isn't a carnival game where you win a stuffed animal.